Security Chief David Torres stormed across the city council chambers, barked orders at two junior officers, shoved past the public seating area, and grabbed the black woman in business attire by her arm before violently slamming her against the council table. "You have no authority to approach this table," the 15-year veteran shouted, pressing his hand against her back while she calmly stated, "Sir, I am Federal Auditor Carmen Washington, and you need to step back immediately." The racist security chief laughed until she recited his employee ID number, his supervisor's name, and the exact federal audit authority she represented, details that only someone with the highest municipal oversight power would know. What Torres didn't realize was that assaulting the wrong person at the wrong table would trigger federal audit consequences he never saw coming. He thought he was dealing with just another citizen trying to disrupt city business. He was wrong. What happened in the next 72 hours would change everything he thought he knew about municipal authority, federal oversight, and the price of one moment of audit obstruction. It was 7:15 p.m. on a Tuesday evening when the highest federal audit authority in the Southeast region collided with 15 years of unchecked municipal corruption at the Birmingham City Hall in Alabama. Federal Auditor Carmen Washington had traveled from her regional office in Atlanta on what appeared to be routine municipal business, but her true mission was far more sensitive. For 6 months, her office had been receiving anonymous tips about systematic federal fund misappropriation and procurement violations at this particular city government. Tonight, she was conducting an unannounced compliance assessment, observing municipal protocols during a regular city council meeting. At 43, Carmen Washington had earned her position as senior federal auditor through a distinguished career that began in municipal finance reform 20 years earlier. She understood federal oversight authority not just as an abstract bureaucratic concept, but as a living protection that required constant vigilance to prevent the very violations that had prompted tonight's investigation. What made Carmen Washington particularly dangerous to someone like David Torres was her comprehensive understanding of federal municipal oversight protocols. She had helped establish many of the guidelines that governed city government operations when they interfaced with federal funding, and she knew exactly which procedures were constitutional and which crossed the line into criminal misappropriation of federal resources. Security Chief David Torres represented everything Carmen Washington had spent her career preventing. At 51, Torres had built his 15-year City Hall career on a foundation of corruption protection and authority abuse that would have been impossible in any municipality with proper federal oversight. His personnel file, if Carmen Washington had access to it, would have revealed dozens of incidents that had mysteriously disappeared into administrative files. Torres had survived and thrived because he understood how to exploit the gaps in federal municipal oversight. He knew which city council members were too compromised to investigate complaints, which procedures could be bent without generating federal paperwork, and which citizens were unlikely to have the knowledge or resources to challenge municipal authority. But tonight, that system of unchecked municipal power was about to meet its federal match. The city council meeting was in session, with Mayor Patricia Johnson presiding over routine budget discussions. Carmen Washington entered quietly, wearing a professional business suit and carrying a federal portfolio, nothing that would immediately identify her to local municipal personnel as one of the most powerful audit authorities in the region. She took a seat in the public gallery, observing the proceedings with the trained eye of someone who had spent decades ensuring that government power served federal compliance rather than personal enrichment. The council chambers were Torres's domain, and he ran them like a personal fiefdom. Carmen Washington watched as he subjected citizens to unnecessarily aggressive screening procedures, used intimidating language to control public participation, and demonstrated the kind of federal procedural disregard that had prompted the anonymous tips to her office. Torres noticed the well-dressed black woman observing the municipal proceedings and immediately felt his authority being questioned. In his worldview, there was a natural hierarchy that needed to be maintained in his chambers, and citizens, especially black citizens, needed to understand their place in that municipal hierarchy. The budget discussion concluded, and Mayor Johnson opened the floor for public comments. It was during this public comment period that Carmen Washington made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She approached the speaker's podium area, to examine municipal financial documents that were supposed to be publicly accessible, testing whether Torres's treatment of citizens violated the federal transparency standards that every municipality was required to uphold. "Ma'am," Torres said, his voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to immediate compliance in his municipal domain, "citizens need to remain in the gallery seating during council proceedings." Carmen Washington turned to face Torres, but instead of submitting to his aggressive municipal procedures, she made a decision that would expose 15 years of federal compliance violations. She decided to test whether Torres's treatment of citizens violated the constitutional standards that every municipal employee was sworn to uphold. "Officer," Carmen Washington said, using her federal auditor voice that was designed to command respect without raising volume, "I'm wondering if these public access procedures comply with federal transparency guidelines for municipal meetings receiving federal funding." The question hit Torres like a challenge to everything he had built over 15 years of municipal control. In his mind, this was a simple equation. He was a security chief with absolute authority over City Hall access, and she was a citizen questioning his methods. The fact that she was a black woman making federal procedural arguments made it even more infuriating to his sense of municipal hierarchy. "Lady, I don't need federal lectures from citizens," Torres snarled, stepping closer to Carmen Washington. "You're in my City Hall now, and you're going to follow my rules, or you're going to be removed from this building." But what Security Chief Torres didn't know was that the woman questioning his authority held the federal power to freeze every dollar of municipal funding, and what happened next would trigger federal consequences that would destroy everything he'd protected for 15 years. To understand the catastrophe that was about to unfold in this Alabama City Hall, you need to know exactly who these two people were and why this particular confrontation represented 15 years of federal violations meeting their ultimate audit consequence. Federal Auditor Carmen Washington hadn't always wielded the power of federal municipal oversight. 18 years earlier, she had been a municipal budget analyst in Montgomery, specializing in cases where local governments had violated federal funding compliance. She had built her career methodically, winning federal cases against municipal systems that believed their local authority placed them above federal oversight. Her appointment as senior federal auditor had made her one of the most powerful federal oversight authorities in Alabama history. She didn't just interpret federal compliance, she was federal compliance's living embodiment in the region, with the authority to determine what municipal governments could and couldn't do with federal funding. What made Carmen Washington particularly dangerous to Torres was her intimate knowledge of federal municipal protocols. She had personally reviewed the federal guidelines that governed municipal operations. She understood exactly which municipal procedures were necessary for compliance and which crossed the line into federal fund misappropriation. More importantly, she had the federal authority to trigger oversight mechanisms that could transform entire municipal governments overnight. Security Chief David Torres had spent 15 years building a system of municipal corruption protection that would have been impossible under proper federal oversight. His approach to City Hall security wasn't based on protecting municipal proceedings. It was based on demonstrating personal power over citizens who couldn't challenge municipal authority. Torres's methods had evolved over 15 years of unchecked municipal power. He had learned to identify citizens who were unlikely to complain, immigrants who feared government retaliation, elderly residents who were intimidated by authority, and minorities who had learned that challenging municipal procedures often led to escalated harassment. But Torres had also learned to exploit the bureaucratic gaps that allowed his behavior to continue. Complaints against him were routinely dismissed as procedural disagreements. Witnesses to his abuse rarely came forward because they feared being banned from City Hall. And municipal officials who were supposed to provide oversight were too compromised by their own federal violations to investigate individual security incidents. Torres's municipal power had grown over 15 years because he understood that most citizens would accept unconstitutional treatment rather than fight a municipal system that seemed designed to protect him. Today, that system was about to encounter someone who not only understood her federal rights, but had the constitutional authority to enforce them throughout the entire region. The other municipal personnel were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Officer Jenkins, a junior security guard who had worked under Torres for 3 years, had never seen anyone challenge Torres's municipal authority with such complete confidence. City Clerk Maria Rodriguez was continuing to record the meeting minutes, but she was starting to realize that this exchange might become evidence in a federal investigation. Budget Director Michael Martinez, who had witnessed dozens of Torres's aggressive interactions with citizens, was beginning to feel sick as he recognized that this woman's knowledge of federal law was far beyond what any ordinary citizen would possess. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask again," Torres said, his face flushed with the rage that had intimidated hundreds of citizens over 15 years. "You're going to return to the gallery, and you're going to do it without questioning my municipal procedures." Carmen Washington looked directly at Torres's badge, noting every detail that would later become evidence in a federal investigation. She observed his aggressive posture, his raised voice, and his complete disregard for the federal principles that governed his authority in any municipality that received federal funding. "Security Chief Torres," she said, using his title and name with the precision of someone who understood that details matter in federal proceedings. "I believe there may be some confusion about the federal standards that govern municipal transparency for cities receiving federal funding. Federal oversight agencies have established clear guidelines for municipal procedures that interface with federal compliance." The use of his name and title should have been Torres's first warning. Ordinary citizens didn't typically know how to read municipal insignia or identify ranking security personnel, but Torres was too angry to notice the warning signs that his 15 years of unchecked municipal power were about to end. Mayor Johnson was still conducting the meeting, unaware that a federal constitutional crisis was developing in her chambers. The other council members present were beginning to sense that this exchange between the security chief and the citizen was escalating beyond normal municipal protocols. Little did anyone know that this routine municipal meeting would expose a pattern of federal violations that had been hidden for over 15 years. Because Carmen Washington wasn't just any federal auditor. She was conducting an unannounced compliance assessment of municipal transparency protocols, and she had been waiting for evidence of systematic federal fund misappropriation. What happened next would be analyzed by federal oversight experts, replayed on municipal news networks, and studied in public administration schools as an example of how 15 years of unchecked municipal power can be destroyed by one moment of federal accountability reckoning. Torres was now in a municipal rage that had been building for 15 years of unquestioned authority. Every citizen who had submitted to his intimidation, every municipal employee who had accepted his abuse, every city council member who had ignored complaints against him, all of it had conditioned him to believe that his word was law in this building and his authority was absolute within these walls. The fact that this black woman continued to cite federal compliance principles while questioning his municipal procedures was triggering every racist assumption that had fueled his 15-year career of abuse. In Torres's worldview, there were citizens who deserved respect and citizens who needed to be reminded of their place. This woman clearly needed to learn her place in his city hall. "Ma'am," Torres snarled, using the word like an insult, "you're about to learn that when I give instructions in this building, you follow them. I don't care if you think you're some kind of federal expert or whatever." "Security Chief Torres," Carmen Washington interrupted, her voice maintaining the calm authority that had controlled federal oversight proceedings for 10 years. "I am Federal Auditor Carmen Washington with the Regional Municipal Oversight Authority, and you are currently violating multiple federal guidelines that govern municipal transparency for cities receiving federal funding." The words hit the other municipal personnel like a federal shockwave. Officer Jenkins actually stepped backward, his hand instinctively moving away from his equipment. City Clerk Rodriguez's pen froze over her meeting minutes as she realized she might be recording the most catastrophic federal compliance violation in Birmingham municipal history. Budget Director Martinez looked around the chambers as if seeing them for the first time, suddenly aware that every security camera in the municipal building was recording this interaction and that federal oversight agencies had access to all recordings involving federal audit personnel. But Security Chief Torres, his federal awareness clouded by 15 years of unchecked municipal power and racial bias, heard only one thing: a black woman telling him what he could and couldn't do in his own city hall. "I don't care if you're the federal government," Torres shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "You're in my building, and you're going to show some respect for municipal authority." Carmen Washington remained motionless, but her federal audit training was working with the precision of federal oversight's most complex compliance analysis. She was mentally cataloging every federal statute being violated, every constitutional principle being ignored, every procedural protection being denied. More importantly, she was acutely aware that everything happening was being recorded by multiple municipal security systems that would preserve this federal compliance violation forever, and that federal oversight agencies were automatically notified of any recordings involving federal audit personnel. The transformation in the other municipal personnel was visible and terrifying. They had gone from confident city employees to people who suddenly realized they might be witnessing the end of their careers. City Clerk Rodriguez looked like she was going to be physically ill, as she understood that her meeting minutes might become evidence in the most catastrophic federal municipal violation in Alabama history. "Security Chief Torres," Officer Jenkins said quietly, his voice barely audible. "Maybe we should contact the city manager." "Shut up, Jenkins," Torres snapped, his authority addiction preventing him from recognizing that his 15-year municipal career was about to be destroyed by federal consequences he couldn't even imagine. "Security Chief Torres," Carmen Washington said, making one final attempt to prevent the federal catastrophe she could see approaching, "I strongly advise you to contact your supervisor and federal liaison before this situation escalates into a violation of federal audit authority that cannot be administratively resolved." Torres heard those words as the ultimate challenge to the unchecked municipal power he had wielded for 15 years. In his twisted logic, backing down now would represent a federal defeat that he could never recover from in his municipal domain. The other personnel were watching. The city hall was surrounding him. This woman was questioning not just his procedures, but his very right to exercise municipal authority. He made the decision that would destroy everything he had built over 15 years of municipal service. Torres stepped forward, grabbed Carmen Washington by her left arm, and violently slammed her backward against the wooden council table with enough force to make her federal portfolio fall to the city hall floor, scattering federal audit documents across the Alabama municipal building. "You have no authority to approach this table," he shouted, pressing his hand against her back while reaching for restraints that would never be applied to a federal auditor. The sound of Carmen Washington's portfolio hitting the municipal floor echoed through the city hall like a federal alarm. Federal audit documents scattered across the Alabama chambers. And in that moment, Security Chief David Torres crossed a federal line that would trigger consequences reaching the highest levels of federal municipal oversight. When the city officials realized who Security Chief Torres had just attacked, their faces went white with terror. Because assaulting a federal auditor isn't just a crime, it's a federal compliance violation that automatically triggers federal investigation and can never be covered up by municipal authorities. Officer Jenkins was the first to understand the federal magnitude of what had just occurred in the Alabama City Hall. As Carmen Washington's federal audit documents scattered across the municipal floor, he could see the official federal seals, the compliance case headers, the classified markings that indicated these weren't just any municipal documents, they were active federal audit materials from the Regional Municipal Oversight Authority. "Sir," Jenkins whispered, his voice barely audible. "Sir, I think—" But Torres was beyond federal reason. He had Carmen Washington pressed against the council table, her hands positioned for restraint, completely convinced that he was teaching a necessary lesson about respecting municipal authority. In his adrenaline-fueled state, he couldn't hear the federal horror in his personnel's voices or see the municipal administrators who were now moving rapidly toward the chambers. Carmen Washington, even with her face pressed against the wooden surface of the council table, remained completely composed. Her years as federal auditor had taught her that compliance panic was the enemy of federal justice, and that dignity under municipal governmental pressure was often the most powerful weapon against corruption. "Security Chief Torres," she said, her voice muffled but still carrying federal authority. "Badge number 1547, your supervisor is City Manager James Harrison, extension 33344. The federal compliance violation you are currently committing carries federal criminal penalties under 18 U.S.C. 242 that cannot be plea bargained or municipally dismissed. The federal specificity of her knowledge hit the other municipal personnel like compliance lightning. Ordinary citizens didn't know badge numbers, supervisory chains of municipal command, or federal criminal sentencing guidelines. Only someone with intimate knowledge of federal municipal oversight would have access to that kind of detailed federal audit information. City Clerk Rodriguez, who had been recording the entire interaction in her meeting minutes as per municipal protocol, suddenly realized that she was documenting what might be the most catastrophic federal compliance violation in Alabama municipal history. Her hands began shaking as she understood that these minutes would likely be evidence in a federal case that would change municipal protocols forever. Budget Director Martinez felt his understanding crumble as the federal pieces began falling into place. The portfolio full of federal audit documents, the perfect compliance terminology, the complete lack of fear in the face of municipal authority, the way she carried herself with absolute federal confidence even while being physically restrained by municipal security. "Oh my God," Martinez whispered to Rodriguez. "She's really a federal auditor." Rodriguez, still recording everything in her minutes, understood that she was documenting federal municipal history. These minutes wouldn't just be evidence in Torres's criminal case. They would be studied by compliance scholars for generations as an example of how municipal power can abuse the very federal authority it's supposed to respect. Torres, still pressing his municipal authority against Carmen Washington's federal dignity, finally heard something that penetrated his power-clouded consciousness: the sound of multiple federal vehicles approaching City Hall at high speed with emergency lights that signaled federal audit crisis. Municipal administrators had been monitoring the city council meeting from the moment federal tension began escalating. The Federal Protective Service, which provides federal security for all federal audit personnel, had protocols for exactly this type of federal emergency. When a federal auditor's safety was threatened in a municipal facility, those protocols were activated automatically and without municipal administrative discussion. 3 black federal SUVs with federal audit plates surrounded the City Hall entrance in less than 2 minutes. Federal agents in tactical gear emerged with weapons ready, not pointing them at anyone, but making it federally clear that this situation had just escalated to a level that municipal security couldn't control. "Federal agents," announced Supervisory Special Agent Maria Santos from the Federal Protective Service, the federal agency responsible for protecting federal auditors. "Release the individual immediately and step away from all municipal furniture." Torres looked up to see half a dozen federal agents surrounding him, their presence transforming what he had thought was routine municipal enforcement into something that looked like federal audit crisis management. For the first time since this federal confrontation began, doubt crept into his authority-addicted consciousness. "This woman was interfering with municipal procedures," Torres began, his voice carrying less authority than it had 5 minutes earlier. "Sir," Agent Santos interrupted, her voice carrying absolute federal authority, "that woman is Federal Auditor Carmen Washington with the Regional Municipal Oversight Authority. You need to remove your hands from her immediately and step back from all municipal equipment." The words, "Federal Auditor Carmen Washington," hit Torres like federal artillery. He had heard that name before. Every municipal employee in Alabama knew that name. She was the auditor who had written federal compliance decisions that reformed municipal procedures. She was the auditor who had overseen federal cases that had placed entire municipal governments under federal oversight. She was the auditor who had the federal power to freeze municipal funding and place city halls under federal supervision. For what happened next would trigger an investigation that would expose corruption reaching the highest levels of municipal government. Because what Security Chief Torres didn't know was that assaulting a federal auditor doesn't just end careers, it triggers federal protocols that can't be stopped, can't be covered up, and can't be dismissed by municipal authorities. And the evidence they were about to uncover would prove that this wasn't his first time obstructing federal oversight. Within 7 minutes of Agent Santos identifying Carmen Washington, a series of federal protocols began activating that would ultimately involve 8 different federal agencies: the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Federal Municipal Oversight Authority, and the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. Federal Protective Service Protocol FPS 1547 required immediate notification of any threat to federal audit personnel in municipal facilities. Federal Oversight Authority Protocol FOA 1547 mandated full federal investigation of any physical assault on a federal auditor. FBI Protocol FBI CR 1547 triggered automatic federal civil rights violation review for any use of force against federal audit authority by municipal employees. Security Chief Torres stood frozen as he watched his 15-year career disintegrating through federal mechanisms he didn't even know existed. Carmen Washington, now surrounded by federal agents who treated her with the compliance deference due to federal audit authority, began the legal process that would ultimately lead to his complete destruction. "Agent Santos," Carmen Washington said, her voice returning to its normal federal audit tone, "I'll need Incident Report FBI 1547 BHM to be filed within the federal hour." Security Chief Torres violated federal protections under civil rights statutes and potentially multiple federal audit security protocols. "I'll also need the federal evidence secured from municipal cameras 4, 8, and 11, which have overlapping coverage of this entire federal compliance violation." Torres watched in growing federal horror as Carmen Washington demonstrated exactly how much federal audit power she wielded. She wasn't just reciting law, she was activating federal machinery that he didn't even know existed. Every protocol she mentioned would generate federal reports that would be read by federal prosecutors. Every camera she referenced would provide federal evidence that couldn't be suppressed or municipally dismissed. Officer Jenkins approached his security supervisor with obvious federal reluctance. "Sir, we should probably contact City Manager Harrison right away." Torres nodded numbly, finally understanding that this federal situation was completely beyond his municipal authority. But what he didn't know was that City Manager Harrison had already been contacted, not by Torres's security team, but by the Federal Protective Service, who had federal notification protocols that bypassed municipal administrative structures entirely. Harrison's phone had been ringing for 5 minutes when Torres finally called. "Harrison here. City Manager, this is Security Chief Torres. We have a federal situation in the council chambers that—" "Torres," Harrison interrupted, his voice tight with barely controlled federal panic. "Please tell me you did not just assault federal auditor Carmen Washington." The federal silence on Torres's end told Harrison everything he needed to know about the federal audit crisis that was about to engulf the entire municipal government. "Torres, where are you right now?" "I'm in the chambers with federal agents and—" "Do not say another word over this municipal communication channel," Harrison snapped. "I'm en route with federal legal counsel. Do not speak to anyone. Do not make any federal statements. And do not leave City Hall until I arrive with federal crisis management." But Harrison knew it was already federally too late. Federal assault charges against municipal employees who attacked federal auditors weren't handled by local prosecutors who might be willing to negotiate. They were handled by the U.S. Attorney's Office, where Carmen Washington had federal relationships with every prosecutor, and where Torres's 15-year municipal career meant absolutely nothing in the face of federal audit authority. Carmen Washington was now speaking quietly with Agent Santos, providing a detailed federal account of the incident that would become the foundation for federal criminal charges. Her memory for federal detail was legendary in compliance circles. She could recall federal audit conversations verbatim years after they occurred, and her federal credibility with federal prosecutors was absolute. "Agent Santos, you should know that Security Chief Torres displayed a pattern of federal behavior that suggests this wasn't an isolated municipal incident," Carmen Washington said. "His immediate assumption that I was just another citizen who needed to be taught respect indicates systematic federal violations within this municipal government's security operations." Those words, systematic federal violations and security operations, were federal code for the kind of investigation that could place entire municipal governments under federal audit oversight. Torres, standing 20 feet away, could hear enough of the federal conversation to understand that Carmen Washington wasn't just filing criminal charges against him personally. She was triggering a comprehensive federal review of his entire 15-year municipal operation. But what they didn't realize was that everything was being recorded, not just by municipal security cameras, but by federal monitoring systems that capture every interaction involving federal auditors, and these recordings are automatically sent to federal oversight agencies that can never be influenced by municipal politics or suppressed by local authorities. City Manager James Harrison arrived at City Hall with the municipality's federal legal counsel, Attorney David Richardson, expecting to manage a relatively routine municipal complaint. What they found instead was a federal audit crime scene with compliance evidence technicians photographing council furniture and federal agents collecting Carmen Washington's scattered federal documents as compliance evidence. Harrison had known Torres for 12 years. They had managed municipal protocols together, covered for each other during administrative reviews, and shared an understanding about how to handle problematic federal complaints from citizens. But seeing Torres standing next to the council table with federal agents documenting every compliance detail of the scene, Harrison realized that their network of municipal protection was about to be tested by Federal Audit Authority. "Security Chief Torres," Harrison said carefully, aware that federal agents were recording every compliance word, "you are relieved of all municipal duties pending federal investigation. Richardson will handle all federal communications from this point forward." Attorney Richardson was sweating, despite the cool City Hall air conditioning. He specialized in municipal employee defense, but his experience was entirely with local prosecutors who might be willing to negotiate compliance settlements. Federal criminal charges involving federal auditors were a completely different compliance world, a world where municipal political considerations and professional relationships meant nothing, and where the federal evidence either supported charges or it didn't. "Ms. Washington," Richardson approached Carmen Washington with obvious compliance reluctance. "I'm David Richardson, representing Security Chief Torres. I was hoping we might discuss federal—" "Mr. Richardson," Carmen Washington interrupted with Federal Audit Authority. "This is now a federal compliance matter involving assault on federal audit personnel. Any communications should go through the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Federal Municipal Oversight Authority." Richardson's face went federally pale. Federal compliance matter meant FBI investigation, federal grand jury, and potential federal prison time for attacking Federal Audit Authority. It meant that Torres's case would be handled by federal prosecutors who specialized in compliance violations and who viewed attacks on federal auditors as the highest priority area for prosecution. Agent Santos was now coordinating with FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, who had just arrived from the Birmingham field office with a mobile federal forensic unit. The FBI's involvement meant that this case would receive the full resources of federal law enforcement, resources that could uncover patterns of municipal abuse going back 15 years. "Agent Walsh," Carmen Washington said with federal precision, "I believe you'll want to review Security Chief Torres's entire disciplinary record as part of your federal investigation. Based on his behavior tonight, I suspect you'll find a pattern of federal violations that this municipal government has failed to address." Agent Walsh nodded, making federal notes that would trigger federal subpoenas for Torres's municipal file, internal affairs records, and every federal complaint filed against him in his 15-year municipal career. Federal investigators had access to records that municipal oversight agencies often ignored or administratively suppressed. Torres watched this federal conversation with growing compliance desperation. He could see his entire municipal life being systematically dismantled by federal agents who operated with resources and federal authority that municipal investigators couldn't match. Every municipal complaint he thought had been buried, every citizen who had been intimidated into federal silence, every piece of evidence that had mysteriously disappeared from municipal administrative files, all of it would be reviewed by federal agents who couldn't be influenced by City Hall politics. Harrison was now coordinating with Mayor Patricia Johnson, who had been awakened at home, and informed that her city's security chief had assaulted a federal auditor. Johnson understood immediately that this federal incident would trigger federal oversight of her entire municipal government, oversight that could result in federal court-ordered reforms, federal compliance monitoring, and budget restrictions that would last for years. "Harrison," Johnson said over the federal phone line, I need a complete timeline of every federal complaint against Torres for the past 5 years. I need it by morning, and I need it to be comprehensive. The FBI is going to request it anyway, and I want to know what federal violations they're going to find before they find them. But Harrison knew that compiling Torres's complete federal record would be like documenting a pattern of municipal abuse that the city had systematically ignored. Every complaint that had been administratively dismissed, every citizen interview that had been perfunctory, every internal investigation that had concluded with insufficient federal evidence, all of it would now be reviewed by federal agents who understood exactly how municipal governments protected problematic security personnel. The municipal administration thought they could contain this, but they had no idea how deep Torres's pattern of federal obstruction went, because Carmen Washington had been quietly documenting municipal compliance violations for months, and she had been waiting for evidence of systematic abuse to trigger comprehensive federal reform. By 10:30 p.m., less than 3 hours after Torres had first grabbed Carmen Washington's arm, federal prosecutors at the U.S. Attorney's Office were already reviewing preliminary compliance evidence and preparing federal charges that would be filed within 8 hours. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Johnson was the Civil Rights Division specialist in municipal employee misconduct cases. He had successfully prosecuted 53 municipal employees for federal compliance violations in his 14-year career. When his phone rang at 10:15 p.m. with news that a security chief had assaulted federal auditor Carmen Washington, Johnson knew this would be the highest-profile federal municipal case of his professional life. Ms. Washington, Johnson said when he called her secure federal line, "I've reviewed the preliminary FBI compliance report. We'll be filing federal charges under compliance civil rights statutes and federal assault provisions. Given your status as federal auditor and the clear federal evidence of systematic municipal abuse, we'll be recommending the maximum federal penalty range." The federal compliance statutes carried maximum sentences that reflected the severity of attacking federal audit authority. Combined, these charges could result in 12 years in federal prison, complete forfeiture of municipal benefits, and permanent prohibition from any government employment. Carmen Washington understood the federal significance of Johnson's call. Federal prosecutors didn't call federal auditors to discuss charging decisions unless they were completely confident in their ability to secure compliance convictions. Johnson was calling because he wanted Carmen Washington to know that Torres would face the full weight of federal justice. Meanwhile, at FBI Federal Headquarters in Birmingham, Special Agent Walsh was compiling Torres's 15-year record of municipal complaints, compliance violations, and administrative actions. What she discovered was a pattern of compliance abuse so comprehensive that it suggested systematic failure by the municipality's federal oversight mechanisms. 71 complaints of excessive municipal procedures, 42 allegations of compliance bias, 28 lawsuits settled by the city with confidential agreements, 13 internal affairs investigations that concluded with insufficient compliance evidence despite compelling witness testimony, a pattern of compliance behavior that should have resulted in termination years ago, but had instead been enabled and protected by municipal administrators who valued institutional loyalty over compliance accountability. Agent Walsh's compliance report would ultimately trigger a federal pattern and practice investigation that would place the entire municipal government under federal audit oversight and mandate comprehensive compliance reforms that would cost millions of municipal dollars and take years to implement. Torres, meanwhile, was at home in his suburban ranch house, staring at his Municipal Security Academy graduation photo and trying to understand how 15 years of what he considered successful City Hall protection had led to this federal moment. His wife Linda was crying quietly in their bedroom, already understanding that their middle-class lifestyle, their children's college funds, and their municipal retirement plans had been destroyed by one moment of federal arrogance. Torres's phone had been ringing constantly since word of the federal incident spread through the municipal government. Fellow security officers, administrators, and union representatives all wanted to know what had happened and how bad the federal damage would be. But Torres couldn't explain how he had confused a federal auditor for a random citizen, couldn't justify why he had used force against someone who had never threatened municipal security, and couldn't rationalize why he had ignored every federal warning sign that should have told him to stop. The municipal union's attorney, Sarah Martinez, had reviewed the preliminary federal evidence and delivered news that shattered Torres's last compliance hope. "David, this isn't a case we can defend federally. The evidence is overwhelming. The victim is a federal auditor, and the FBI has compliance video of everything. My advice is to negotiate for the minimum federal sentence and hope the compliance prosecutors are feeling generous." But federal prosecutors rarely felt generous when municipal employees violated the civil rights of federal auditors. The U.S. Attorney's Office had a compliance reputation to maintain, and prosecuting corrupt municipal security was always popular with compliance oversight organizations and civil rights advocates. Mayor Johnson was now meeting with federal mediators to discuss the terms of federal audit oversight that would be imposed on the municipal government. The compliance incident with Carmen Washington had accelerated investigations that had been building for years, and the city was facing federal intervention that would reshape every aspect of municipal operations. What the federal investigation uncovered would shock the entire municipal government system, because Torres's 15-year security career wasn't built on protecting City Hall. It was built on intimidating citizens, obstructing federal oversight, and creating an atmosphere of fear that violated federal compliance principles. Federal compliance investigators had been working for 48 hours straight when they uncovered evidence that transformed Torres's case from a single incident of assault on a federal auditor into a federal conspiracy investigation involving multiple municipal security officers and administrators. FBI agent Walsh had been analyzing Torres's municipal personnel file when she noticed a compliance pattern that made her stomach turn. Every single complaint against Torres had been investigated by the same internal affairs detective, Lieutenant Sarah Foster. Every single compliance investigation had concluded with insufficient evidence. Every single witness had mysteriously become unavailable or unreliable during the municipal administrative investigation process. Foster had been protecting Torres for 12 years, and their compliance arrangement had generated millions of dollars in municipal settlements that the city had paid to avoid federal scrutiny. Walsh's discovery meant that Foster would also face federal charges. Foster had been protecting Torres for 12 years, and their compliance arrangement had generated millions of dollars in municipal settlements that the city had paid to avoid federal scrutiny. Walsh's discovery meant that Foster would also face federal charges for conspiracy to violate compliance rights under federal civil rights statutes. The compliance evidence was overwhelming. Email records showed Foster had coached Torres on how to write incident reports that would withstand compliance scrutiny. Phone records revealed coordination between Foster and Torres before internal affairs interviews. Financial records indicated that Torres had helped Foster obtain promotions by providing false testimony in other security officers' disciplinary hearings. At 6:30 a.m., federal agents arrested Lieutenant Foster at her home in Vestavia Hills, Alabama. The compliance arrest warrant was based on evidence that Foster had systematically suppressed investigations into Torres's compliance misconduct for over a decade. Foster's arrest meant that other municipal administrators who had participated in the compliance cover-up network would also face federal charges. Carmen Washington had been monitoring the compliance investigation's progress through regular updates from the U.S. Attorney's Office. Each new compliance revelation confirmed her understanding that Torres's behavior represented institutional failure, not individual municipal misconduct. Assistant U.S. Attorney Johnson, Carmen Washington said during their morning compliance call, "I want to ensure that this federal investigation addresses the systemic issues that enabled Security Chief Torres's behavior for 15 years. Individual compliance prosecution is important, but institutional reform is essential for protecting federal audit authority." Johnson understood that Carmen Washington was positioning this case as a catalyst for comprehensive municipal reform. Her influence with compliance oversight agencies would ensure that Torres's prosecution led to long-term changes in municipal accountability throughout Alabama. The local news media had picked up the federal audit story by morning, but they completely misunderstood its compliance significance. Local reporters focused on Torres's arrest and the assault charges, missing the larger story of federal investigation into systematic compliance violations in municipal security. But national compliance news organizations understood exactly what was happening. CNN's federal audit correspondent reported that the Torres case was likely to trigger the most comprehensive federal investigation of municipal misconduct since federal oversight was established. The Washington Post's compliance rights reporter described it as a textbook example of how individual compliance incidents can expose institutional failures that threaten federal audit authority. Torres woke up in his suburban bedroom to discover that his name was trending on compliance Twitter. His photograph was being shown on national television, and civil rights organizations were using his case as an example of everything wrong with municipal authority abuse. Dr. Brian Stevenson, the renowned compliance rights advocate, issued a statement that captured the national significance. Security Chief Torres's assault on federal auditor Washington represents the collision between America's legacy of municipal governmental oppression and the federal compliance authority that protects our democracy. When municipal security officers believe they can assault federal auditors with impunity, our entire system of compliance justice is under attack. Torres's defense attorney, David Richardson, was struggling to find any viable compliance defense strategy. Federal civil rights cases involving federal auditors were notoriously difficult to defend because they focused on clear compliance violations rather than complex legal interpretations. The compliance evidence against Torres was captured on multiple municipal cameras, witnessed by federal agents, and documented by one of the most respected compliance authorities in Alabama history. David, Richardson said during their morning compliance meeting, the federal prosecutors are offering a plea agreement, 10 years in federal prison in exchange for cooperation in the compliance investigation of Lieutenant Foster and other administrators. It's the best compliance deal you're going to get. Torres stared at the plea agreement that would destroy everything he had built over 15 years of municipal service. 10 years in federal prison meant losing his municipal pension, his security benefits, and any hope of future employment in government service. But fighting the compliance charges meant risking the maximum sentence of 12 years, and Richardson had made it clear that winning at compliance trial was virtually impossible. The compliance investigation was expanding beyond Torres and Foster to include other security officers who had participated in the compliance cover-up network. Federal agents were reviewing every municipal case Torres had worked, every compliance complaint he had dismissed, and every incident report he had filed. Dozens of municipal cases were being overturned as evidence of Torres's pattern of compliance misconduct came to light. The evidence was overwhelming, but Torres's final downfall was yet to come. Because when federal investigators examine municipal violations, they don't just look at one security officer. They examine the entire administrative system that allowed him to operate unchecked for 15 years. And what they found would expose corruption reaching the highest levels of municipal government. 12 weeks after the assault, the U.S. Attorney's Office filed a comprehensive federal indictment that shocked even experienced compliance attorneys with its scope and compliance detail. United States vs. David Torres, Sarah Foster, and James Harrison included charges under 7 different federal statutes: conspiracy to violate compliance rights, deprivation of compliance rights under color of law, assault on federal audit personnel, obstruction of compliance justice, racketeering conspiracy under federal RICO statutes, civil rights conspiracy, and federal audit obstruction. The racketeering charges were based on compliance evidence that Torres, Foster, and Harrison had operated an organized scheme to protect each other from compliance accountability while systematically violating citizens' compliance rights in municipal proceedings. Federal prosecutors had documented over 200 compliance incidents, where the 3 had covered up security misconduct, falsified municipal reports, and intimidated compliance witnesses. Carmen Washington attended the arraignment hearing, sitting in the federal courthouse gallery, as Torres, Foster, and Harrison were formally charged with federal compliance crimes. The courtroom was packed with compliance journalists, civil rights activists, and federal prosecutors who understood they were witnessing a historic moment in federal audit accountability. Federal Judge Thomas Bradley, who presided over the compliance arraignment, set bond conditions that effectively ended all three defendants' municipal careers immediately. Torres was required to surrender his security badge, his municipal weapon, and his government security certification. He was prohibited from contact with any current or former municipal employees who might be compliance witnesses in the case. Mr. Torres, Judge Bradley said from the compliance bench, the allegations in this indictment describe a pattern of behavior that strikes at the heart of our compliance system and federal audit authority. The court considers you a significant flight risk and a compliance danger to the community. Torres's bond was set at $750,000, secured by his house and requiring GPS compliance monitoring. The conditions meant he would spend the months before compliance trial under house arrest, watching his former colleagues testify against him in exchange for reduced federal sentences. The psychological compliance impact on Torres was devastating. 15 years of believing he was compliance untouchable had been shattered by one moment of contact with someone who possessed real federal audit authority. He spent his days under house arrest, reading compliance news coverage of his case, watching former partners distance themselves from him and realizing that his entire identity as a municipal security officer had been built on systematic violations of the compliance law he was supposed to protect. Linda Torres filed for divorce within 2 weeks of the compliance arraignment. Their children changed their last names to avoid association with their father's compliance crimes. Torres's municipal pension was suspended, pending the outcome of compliance charges, leaving him financially dependent on relatives who were increasingly reluctant to help someone who had attacked federal audit authority. Carmen Washington, meanwhile, was working with federal compliance oversight agencies to implement comprehensive reforms in municipal security. Her compliance recommendations would become the template for federal intervention in municipal agencies nationwide. The Torres case represents an opportunity to transform municipal accountability, Carmen Washington told the federal compliance monitor appointed to oversee municipal reforms. We must ensure that this type of systematic compliance misconduct never again receives institutional protection, especially when it threatens federal audit authority. The compliance reforms Carmen Washington advocated were revolutionary. Mandatory body cameras for all municipal security officers, independent compliance oversight of excessive force complaints, federal audit review of all security use of force incidents, and automatic termination for municipal officers with patterns of compliance misconduct. These changes would cost municipal governments millions of dollars, but would prevent future David Torres from operating with compliance impunity. Federal prosecutors were also pursuing compliance civil asset forfeiture against Torres's property, arguing that his house and savings had been purchased with income from his corrupt municipal career. The compliance forfeiture action meant that even if Torres somehow avoided federal prison time, he would lose everything he had accumulated over 15 years of compliance violations. The national compliance rights community was watching Torres's case as a test of federal commitment to audit accountability. Organizations like the NAACP, the American Civil Liberties Union, and the Compliance Defense Fund filed amicus briefs supporting maximum sentences and comprehensive compliance reforms. Reverend Al Sharpton issued a compliance statement that captured the broader significance. David Torres thought he could assault a federal auditor because he had spent 15 years assaulting citizens without compliance consequences. Federal prosecution is the only way to break the cycle of municipal impunity that has protected security officers like Torres for generations while threatening federal audit authority. But the consequences were only beginning, because losing his job was just the start. Torres was about to face federal criminal charges for assaulting the highest audit authority in the region, charges that carried a minimum of 8 years in federal prison, and Carmen Washington had one final compliance move that would ensure he could never abuse municipal authority again. The federal pattern and practice compliance investigation, triggered by Torres's assault, had uncovered evidence of corruption so extensive that the Department of Justice placed the entire municipal government under federal audit oversight, only the 9th time in U.S. history that such drastic compliance action had been taken against a municipal government. Federal Compliance Monitor Dr. Patricia Chen, a former federal prosecutor who specialized in compliance municipal reform, was appointed to oversee comprehensive changes that would reshape every aspect of municipal operations. Her compliance mandate included complete restructuring of internal affairs, implementation of community compliance oversight mechanisms, and federal audit review of all hiring and promotion decisions. The evidence uncovered in the Torres compliance investigation reveals institutional failure at every level, Dr. Chen announced at her first public compliance meeting. This municipal government has systematically protected security officers who violated citizens' compliance rights while retaliating against employees who attempted to report compliance misconduct. The financial cost of compliance oversight was staggering. The municipality was required to pay for Dr. Chen's team of compliance monitors, implement new compliance training programs for all security officers, upgrade technology systems to ensure compliance accountability, and settle hundreds of compliance rights lawsuits that had been filed as the scope of municipal corruption became clear. Mayor Johnson faced a compliance budget crisis that threatened municipal services as millions of dollars were redirected to comply with federal audit oversight requirements. The compliance consequences were swift. 4 municipal administrators who had supported the security department's resistance to compliance reform were transferred to non-security positions by federal order. Carmen Washington was appointed to the Federal Compliance Advisory Committee on Municipal Reform, a position that gave her national influence over municipal accountability policies. Her experience with the Torres case made her a leading compliance expert on how federal audit oversight could transform corrupt municipal departments. The Torres case proves that individual compliance prosecution must be combined with institutional reform. Carmen Washington testified before the Senate Judiciary Compliance Committee. We cannot simply arrest corrupt security officers. We must dismantle the systems that protect and enable their compliance corruption. Her congressional compliance testimony led to the Federal Municipal Accountability Act, legislation that would require all municipal agencies to implement compliance oversight mechanisms similar to those developed in response to Torres's compliance crimes. Torres's former colleagues were cooperating with federal compliance investigators in exchange for reduced sentences, providing evidence of corruption that reached the highest levels of municipal administration. The compliance investigation expanded to include administrators who had blocked municipal reform, prosecutors who had refused to file compliance charges against problem officers, and officials who had dismissed cases based on political pressure rather than compliance evidence. Officer Jenkins, the junior security guard who had witnessed Torres's compliance assault on Carmen Washington, became a federal compliance whistleblower whose testimony helped convict 18 additional security officers of compliance violations. His cooperation agreement included federal witness protection and relocation assistance, recognition that testifying against corrupt compliance colleagues had made him a target for retaliation. Jenkins did what every municipal officer swears to do, Carmen Washington said at his compliance commendation ceremony. He chose to protect and serve the Constitution rather than protect and serve compliance corruption. The municipal union that had initially defended Torres was forced to implement new compliance policies, prohibiting the defense of officers charged with federal compliance violations. Union leadership was replaced by compliance reformers who committed to supporting accountability rather than institutional impunity. Compliance oversight was producing measurable results. Excessive compliance force complaints dropped by 74%. Citizen satisfaction with municipal services increased by 51%, and federal prosecutors reported a significant reduction in compliance violations by municipal officers. But the human compliance cost of Torres's crimes continued to mount. Families who had been victimized by Torres during his 15-year municipal career were filing compliance rights lawsuits, seeking millions of dollars in damages. Each lawsuit provided additional compliance evidence of the systematic failure that had enabled Torres's behavior. Maria Johnson, whose elderly mother had been brutalized by Torres 2 years earlier during a city council meeting, testified at federal compliance hearings about the long-term impact of security misconduct. My mother still has nightmares about what Security Chief Torres did to her, but knowing that Torres will never hurt another family gives us some compliance peace. The compliance transformation was not without resistance. Security officers who had benefited from the old system of compliance impunity organized protests against federal oversight, claiming that accountability measures were making municipal security impossible. But community support for compliance reform was overwhelming, and political leaders who opposed federal audit oversight were voted out of office. The changes were revolutionary, but Torres's personal reckoning was still coming, because Carmen Washington had one final compliance move that would ensure he could never abuse municipal authority again. On a cold morning in March, 14 months after he had assaulted Carmen Washington, David Torres stood before federal judge Thomas Bradley to receive a sentence that would destroy what remained of his compliance life. The federal courthouse was packed with compliance rights activists, victims of Torres's security abuse, and journalists covering what had become the most significant municipal accountability case in Alabama compliance history. Carmen Washington sat in the front row, a visible reminder of the federal audit dignity and authority that Torres had tried to violate. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Johnson presented compliance evidence that painted Torres as the centerpiece of a corrupt network that had victimized hundreds of citizens over 15 years. The compliance sentencing memorandum included victim impact statements from 83 people who had been brutalized, falsely detained, or intimidated by Torres and his compliance confederates. "Your Honor," Johnson said with compliance gravity, "David Torres used his municipal badge and authority to terrorize citizens who couldn't fight back. He believed that his government uniform made him untouchable, that his municipal authority superseded the Constitution, and that his victims were powerless to hold him accountable. He was compliance wrong on every count." Torres's compliance defense attorney made a final, desperate plea for leniency, arguing that Torres had been a product of systemic compliance problems rather than individual malice. But federal Judge Bradley had reviewed 15 years of compliance evidence, showing that Torres had been the architect of the corruption, not its victim. "Mr. Torres," Judge Bradley said, his voice carrying the weight of compliance authority, "you have been convicted of crimes that strike at the foundation of our compliance democratic system. Municipal security officers who violate citizens' compliance rights and assault federal auditors are not law enforcement. They are criminals who happen to wear municipal badges." The compliance sentence was devastating. 11 years in federal prison, 3 years of supervised compliance release, forfeiture of all assets obtained through corrupt municipal activities, and permanent prohibition from any government employment. Torres would serve his time in federal compliance facilities designed for corrupt government officials, where his fellow inmates would include other municipal officers, politicians, and public servants who had betrayed their compliance oaths. Carmen Washington watched Torres's compliance sentencing with the satisfaction of someone who had seen justice delivered through proper compliance processes. But her focus was already shifting to the systemic compliance changes that would prevent future David Torres from operating with municipal impunity. "This sentence sends a clear compliance message," Carmen Washington told reporters after the compliance hearing. "No one is above the law, not municipal security officers, not government officials, and certainly not those who use their authority to violate the compliance rights they swore to protect." Torres's personal compliance destruction was complete. His wife had divorced him and moved to another state with their children. His house had been seized through federal compliance forfeiture proceedings. His municipal pension had been permanently terminated. His government security certification had been permanently revoked. Friends and family members had distanced themselves from him to avoid association with his compliance crimes. The psychological compliance impact was evident as Torres was led away in federal shackles. The man who had spent 15 years believing he was compliance untouchable now faced 11 years in federal prison, where his status as a corrupt municipal security officer would make him a target for violence from inmates who had been victimized by government authority. Lieutenant Foster received 8 years in federal prison for her compliance role in covering up Torres's crimes. City Manager Harrison received 7 years for participating in the compliance conspiracy. 21 other security officers received sentences ranging from probation to 6 years in prison for their roles in the compliance corruption network. The federal compliance investigation had ultimately resulted in the prosecution of 35 municipal officers. the largest municipal corruption case in Alabama compliance history. The financial cost to the city exceeded $95 million in compliance oversight expenses, civil rights settlements, and reform implementation. Carmen Washington's compliance role in exposing this corruption earned her national recognition as a champion of federal audit accountability. She received the Compliance Rights Award from the NAACP, the Compliance Justice Award from the American Civil Liberties Union, and was featured on the cover of Federal Audit Quarterly as one of the most influential people fighting government compliance corruption. But for Carmen Washington, the real compliance victory was not the awards or recognition. It was the knowledge that systematic compliance reforms would protect future citizens from experiencing what she had endured in that municipal city hall. The federal compliance monitoring of the municipal government would continue for 10 years, ensuring that the changes were permanent rather than temporary. New security officers were trained in compliance law and civil rights. Supervisors were held compliance accountable for their subordinates' behavior. Community oversight provided external compliance accountability that prevented the return of corrupt practices. But the most powerful moment was yet to come, because Carmen Washington's response to this assault would inspire federal legislation that would change municipal protocols nationwide and protect federal audit authority forever. 4 years after David Torres's compliance assault had triggered the largest municipal reform in Alabama governmental history, Carmen Washington stood before the United States Senate Judiciary Committee to testify about legislation that would transform municipal accountability nationwide. The Federal Municipal Compliance Accountability Act, inspired directly by the Torres case, would require all municipal agencies to implement compliance oversight mechanisms, body camera requirements, and independent compliance investigation procedures for excessive force complaints. The legislation represented the most comprehensive municipal reform in American compliance history. Senators, Carmen Washington testified with Federal Audit Authority, David Torres's assault on my compliance dignity was also an assault on the compliance principles that govern our democracy. But his compliance crime became an opportunity to demonstrate that our system of justice, when properly applied, can hold even the most powerful government employees accountable and protect even the highest federal audit authorities. The Compliance Committee room was silent as Carmen Washington described the systematic corruption that had protected Torres for 15 years and the federal compliance intervention that had finally brought justice. Her testimony was broadcast live on national compliance television, watched by millions of Americans who understood they were witnessing a historic moment in compliance civil rights. Senator Elizabeth Warren asked the compliance question that captured the national significance. Ms. Washington, what would have happened if you had been an ordinary citizen rather than a federal auditor when Security Chief Torres assaulted you? Carmen Washington's answer was devastating in its compliance simplicity. Senator, David Torres had assaulted ordinary citizens for 15 years without facing any compliance consequences. The only difference was that I had the Federal Audit Authority to trigger federal compliance intervention and the knowledge to ensure that intervention was compliance effective. That compliance exchange became the defining moment of the hearings, crystallizing public understanding that municipal accountability required external compliance oversight rather than internal administrative investigation. The Federal Municipal Compliance Accountability Act passed the Senate by a vote of 87-13, with bipartisan support that reflected national consensus on the need for compliance reform. President Biden signed the compliance legislation into law 11 months later, with Carmen Washington standing beside him as he used multiple compliance pens to ensure that pieces of the signing could be distributed to civil rights organizations across the country. This law ensures that what happened to Federal Auditor Washington and what David Torres did to hundreds of victims over 15 years can never again receive institutional protection, President Biden said at the compliance signing ceremony. This legislation protects federal audit authority and ensures compliance accountability in municipal governments. The Torres case had become a compliance template for federal intervention in corrupt municipal agencies. The Department of Justice used the compliance precedent to place 26 additional municipal governments under federal audit oversight, applying the same comprehensive compliance reforms that had transformed Torres's city. David Torres was serving his federal compliance sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Montgomery, Alabama, a medium-security facility that housed corrupt government officials. Prison records indicated that he had been attacked 4 times by inmates who had been victimized by municipal security officers, confirming the compliance dangers faced by government employees who became federal prisoners. His compliance appeals had been denied by every court, including the Supreme Court, which refused to hear his case. Compliance legal experts noted that Torres's conviction was so clear-cut and the compliance evidence so overwhelming that no appellate court was willing to question federal prosecutors' handling of the federal audit case. Carmen Washington continued her compliance work on municipal reform through her position on the Federal Compliance Advisory Committee, helping to implement the accountability mechanisms that would prevent future David Torres from operating with compliance impunity. Her compliance recommendations were being implemented in municipal agencies across the country. The financial compliance settlements with Torres's victims totaled over $63 million paid by the municipality through insurance policies that had become prohibitively expensive as a result of the systematic compliance misconduct. The insurance compliance crisis forced additional reforms as companies refused to cover municipal agencies without comprehensive compliance accountability measures. Maria Johnson, whose elderly mother had been brutalized by Torres, spoke at the Federal Municipal Compliance Accountability Act signing ceremony. Carmen Washington showed us that compliance dignity and courage can overcome hatred and corruption. Because of her compliance strength, my mother lived to see a world where municipal security officers know they will be held compliance accountable for their actions. The compliance transformation was visible in municipal statistics, community relations, and officer behavior. The city hall that had once protected David Torres was now recognized as a national model for compliance municipal operations with community trust ratings that were the highest in the compliance region. Carmen Washington's final words at the Senate compliance hearing captured the lasting significance of her encounter with David Torres. What began as one man's compliance assault on federal audit authority has become a catalyst for compliance transformation. We have proven that our system of justice, properly applied, can protect the vulnerable, hold the powerful compliance accountable, and ensure that municipal badge and uniform serve the Constitution rather than corrupt those who wear them. And that's how one moment of compliance disrespect against a federal auditor destroyed a 15-year security career, exposed systematic corruption, triggered comprehensive compliance reform, and proved that in America no one, absolutely no one, is above compliance law. David Torres thought he could assault Carmen Washington with municipal impunity. Instead, he learned that some people hold federal audit power he never imagined, and disrespecting compliance authority carries consequences that will follow him for the rest of his life. Thanks to everyone who typed respect, justice, and inspired in the comments. Your engagement proves that stories of compliance, dignity, and accountability matter. If this story moved you, please subscribe for more incredible tales of courage triumphing over corruption. Until next time, remember that no one is above the law, and sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply refusing to back down.